The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the New Mexico territory in shades of gold and amber as Captain James Morrison secured the perimeter of his small outpost. The war had been over for 3 years, but its ghost still haunted him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He'd returned to the frontier seeking solitude, hoping the vast emptiness of the desert would somehow fill the hollow spaces the conflict had carved into his soul. Instead, he'd found himself caught in another war, this one between settlers and the Apache tribes who'd called this land home for generations. The woman sat near the fire, her hands bound loosely in front of her, her dark eyes watching him with a mixture of wariness and defiance. Her name was Kai, which meant willow in her language, and she'd been his prisoner for nearly a week. He'd found her injured after a skirmish between his patrol and a band of Apache warriors, left behind when her people had to flee quickly. Protocol dictated he should have taken her to the fort, turned her over to his superiors, but something had stopped him. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him with pain and pride warring in her expression, or maybe it was simply that he was tired of following orders that led to more suffering. So he'd brought her here instead, to this abandoned ranch house he'd claimed as a kind of sanctuary, miles from anywhere. He'd tended her wounds, a deep gash on her shoulder and a sprained ankle, and she'd accepted his help with silent dignity. They'd developed an uneasy coexistence over the days, communicating through gestures and the few words of each other's languages they'd managed to teach one another. Tonight felt different somehow. The air was charged with something James couldn't name, a tension that had nothing to do with captor and captive and everything to do with two lonely souls circling each other like wounded animals. He'd prepared a simple meal, beans and cornbread, and she'd eaten without complaint, though he knew it was nothing like the food of her people. After dinner, as the fire crackled and the desert night brought its characteristic chill, James found himself talking. He hadn't intended to. Words had become scarce for him since the war, each one feeling like it cost something he couldn't afford to spend. But perhaps it was the isolation, or the way she listened without judgment, or simply the human need to be known by another person, even an enemy. "I haven't slept beside a woman since the war," he said quietly, the admission hanging in the air between them like smoke. He wasn't sure why he'd said it, wasn't even sure she'd understood. But he continued anyway, the words coming easier now that he'd started. "Had a wife once. Sarah. Met her in Virginia before everything fell apart. She had hair the color of wheat and a laugh that made you forget whatever was troubling you." Kai watched him, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. She said something in Apache, her voice soft and melodic, and though he didn't understand the words, he sensed she was encouraging him to continue. "We got married right before I enlisted. Thought the war would be over in a few months, that I'd come home and we'd start our life together properly. Build a house, have children, grow old watching sunsets from a porch swing." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Funny how we tell ourselves stories about the future, like we have any say in how things turn out. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. The war dragged on. Years of it. Blood and mud and boys crying for their mothers. I saw things, did things, that changed me into someone Sarah wouldn't have recognized. Maybe someone I don't recognize. Kai shifted slightly, and he noticed her wince as she moved her injured shoulder. Without thinking, he stood and retrieved the salve he'd been using on her wounds. She tensed as he approached, but didn't pull away when he knelt beside her and carefully applied the medicine. Her skin was warm under his fingers, and he found himself acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd touched another person with gentleness rather than violence. "She wrote me letters," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Every week, like clockwork. Told me about the town, about her garden, about the dress she was making for when I came home. I carried those letters with me everywhere, read them so many times the paper started to fall apart. They were the only thing that kept me human when everything around me was trying to turn me into something else." He finished with the salve and sat back, but didn't return to his place across the fire. Instead, he remained close to her, near enough to feel the warmth of her presence. Then the letters stopped. "At first, I thought it was just the mail being slow. The war was chaos, and deliveries were unpredictable. But weeks went by, then months and nothing. I told myself she was fine, that she'd just gotten busy or maybe the letters were lost." Kai reached out then, slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted. When he didn't, she placed her bound hands gently on his arm. The gesture was simple but profound, a small bridge across the vast divide between them. When the war finally ended, I went home, James said, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept locked away for so long. The house was empty. Neighbors told me she'd gotten sick. Cholera had swept through the town while I was gone. She'd been dead for almost a year, and I hadn't even known. Hadn't felt it. I was halfway across the country killing and trying not to be killed, and the only person I'd ever loved was dying alone. He fell silent, and for a long moment, the only sounds were the fire and the distant call of a coyote. Then Kai spoke, her English halting but clear enough to understand. My husband, she said, pointing to herself. Dead also. Soldiers kill. 2 winters ago. James looked at her, really looked at her, and saw his own grief reflected back at him. They were enemies by circumstance, divided by culture and conflict and the cruelty of history, but in this moment, they were simply 2 people who'd lost everything and somehow survived. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. I'm sorry for what was done to your people, to your family. I'm sorry for all of it. She studied his face, as if trying to determine the sincerity of his words. Then she nodded slowly. You sorry. I sorry. No change dead. No, he agreed. It doesn't change anything. But maybe it means something anyway. As the night deepened, they talked more, piecing together their stories through broken language and shared understanding. Kai told him about her husband, a warrior who'd fought to protect their way of life, who'd been cut down during a raid on their village. She told him about the child she'd lost soon after, born too early in her grief and stress, who'd lived only a few hours before slipping away. James listened, and in listening, felt something shift inside him. The fortress he'd built around his heart, stone by stone during the war years, began to develop cracks. He told her things he'd never spoken aloud, not even to himself in the darkest nights. About the boy he'd killed in his first battle, who couldn't have been more than 15. About the friend who'd died in his arms, whispering his sweetheart's name with his last breath. About the emptiness that had consumed him when he'd stood in Sarah's grave and realized he didn't know how to cry anymore. You still have tears, Kai said softly, reaching up to touch his cheek where wetness had tracked through the dust. He hadn't even realized he was crying. They sat together as the fire burned low, and when the cold became too much, James retrieved blankets. He laid one out for her, as he had every night, then prepared to take his usual position across the small room. But she caught his hand as he turned to go. Cold, she said simply. You cold. I cold. Fire dying. He understood what she was offering, or maybe what they were both acknowledging. Not intimacy in the way he'd once known with Sarah, but something equally profound. The simple comfort of another human presence, the warmth of not being alone in the darkness. They'd both spent too many nights in solitary grief, carrying their losses like stones in their chest. James hesitated, aware of the impropriety, the complications, the dozen reasons this was wrong. But then he looked at her eyes and saw no seduction, no agenda, just honest need. The same need that gnawed at him every night when he lay down alone and remembered what it felt like to have another heartbeat near his own. Okay, he said quietly, and lay down beside her on the blankets, careful to maintain a respectful distance. She turned on her side, her back to him, and after a moment's hesitation, he shaped himself around her, providing warmth without presumption. She fit against him like a memory, and he realized with a start that this was what he'd meant when he'd confessed he hadn't slept beside a woman since the war. Not just the physical proximity, but this vulnerability, this trust, this acknowledgement of mutual humanity. My name, she said softly into the darkness, is Nate. Kai. Easier for white tongue. But my name is Nate. Means mischief maker. My mother's joke. Nate, he repeated carefully, trying to honor the pronunciation. I'm James. Not Jim or Jimmy. James. It was my grandfather's name. James, she said, testing it. James who sorry. James who cry for dead wife. Nate who fights, he replied. Nate who survives. She made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been something else. We both survive, she said. Maybe that enough. Maybe that everything. They fell silent again, but it was a different silence now, companionable rather than tense. James felt her breathing slow and deepen as sleep claimed her, and he marveled at the trust that implied. She was his prisoner, he was her captor, they were supposed to be enemies. Yet here she was, allowing herself to be vulnerable in his presence, believing at some fundamental level that he wouldn't harm her. As he lay there in the darkness, listening to her breathe and feeling the warmth of her body against his, James thought about all the ways the world had tried to make them hate each other. The propaganda, the fear, the violence that bred more violence in an endless cycle. He thought about the men in his unit who spoke of the Apache as savages, subhuman, deserving of whatever fate befell them. He thought about the settlers who told stories of atrocities, using fear to justify their own brutal actions. But the woman sleeping in his arms was no savage. She was a person who'd loved and lost, who'd fought for her home and her people, who'd shown him more grace in a week than he'd received in 3 years of war. She was, in all the ways that mattered, not so different from himself. The realization should have troubled him, should have made him question everything he'd been told, everything he'd fought for. And perhaps it did. But in this moment, wrapped in the peace of unexpected companionship, he found he couldn't muster the energy for doubt or recrimination. There would be time enough tomorrow to wrestle with the implications, to figure out what to do next, to face the consequences of his choices. Tonight, for the first time since he'd stood at Sarah's grave and felt the last of his hope die, James felt something like peace. Not happiness, not yet, maybe not ever, but a quiet recognition that he was still alive, still capable of feeling something beyond pain and numbness. Nature had given him that, perhaps without even meaning to, simply by accepting his comfort and offering her own. He didn't know what the morning would bring. He'd have to make a decision about her soon, about whether to take her to the fort or let her go, about whether to stay on the frontier or return to civilization, about whether he could live with himself either way. But those were problems for tomorrow's James, the man who'd have to face the world in daylight. Tonight, he was simply James, lying beside a woman for the first time since the war, remembering what it meant to be human, to connect, to care. And if his last thought before sleep claimed him was that he'd do anything to protect this fragile peace they'd found, that he couldn't imagine handing her over to people who'd see her as less than she was, well, that was something else to worry about when the sun rose. For now, there was only warmth and breath, and the profound comfort of not being alone in the darkness. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.